Okay, constant gamers. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode of Roleplayer with 1,000 Faces. My name is Matt Yancik. I am the founder and I'm the head game master of Manufactured Myth and Legerdemain. And today I'm super excited because I have someone here with me from a part of the world that I'm always excited to talk to. I have had many students from Saudi Arabia. So today I have with me Safia Aldulaijan. And Safia is a fantasy writer and a dungeon master and community organizer and leader with a love for history. So Safia runs a group called the Crossroads Guild, and that's a community for tabletop role-playing gamers in Eastern Province, Saudi Arabia. And through her group, she organizes one-shot games and also workshops and seminars in order to build like a better role-playing community in her. And I would imagine by building a better role-playing community, it's also a better community in general in her area. So, and as if that weren't enough, one of my personal favorite things that Safia's been working on is running something called the Zakhara Re-Told live stream on 20 Arabia RPG. And in the live stream, it's a super interesting look at D&D's Al-Qadim setting from like a cultural and a linguistic and a storytelling standpoint. And from what I understand, and she'll maybe let us know later, I think she's going to be running a campaign in that same area. So Safia, after all of the gibberish that I've just sort of spewed there, thank you for putting up with that. How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic, and thank you for having me here. I'm excited.
No, I'm glad to have you. So I kind of wanted to get into just who are you anyway? Tell us something about yourself. I know that I sort of presented some things, but tell us the real story. Who are you, Safia? What are you doing over there?
Well, I'm Safia, and as mentioned, I'm from Saudi Arabia, and um, I spend most of my time either trying to write or writing.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Fantasy fiction has always been something I've been interested in, and so it was an easy draw for me to want to get into writing fantasy fiction, whether it's my own projects or online text role plays, or eventually and more recently, Dungeons and Dragons.
Oh, that's cool. Now, wait a minute. You said you've been into fantasy, kind of like stories and things like that for a long time. Can we
Yeah.
trace this back to a certain moment in your childhood where
Yeah.
you first discovered?
Yes. So for me, the first discovery of fantasy came from reading books as a kid. And a lot of these were fiction books, such as uh, reading stories like The Young Princess or uh, other tales. And then eventually, I think the big major one that got to me really was Harry Potter.
Mm,
When I was, I got into it as books before it became movies. And that idea of just having this huge fantasy world just blew my mind. But at the same time, I was also playing video games, and that
mm,
showed me fantasy in its own way. So that involved Final Fantasy, whether I was playing them or if I was too young watching my brother play them. So those hand in hand led to my interest in fantasy fiction. I did focus more on books, so
mm.
quickly enough, I ended up reading The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, and that went on to other fantasy series. Um, Both ones that are more famous and ones that are a lot less famous, and I've loved them all. As a kid, I'd read so much that my dad would ask me if I'm eating the books.
Yeah, I kind of identify with that. My father never specifically asked me if I was eating books, but yeah, I seem to go through them quite a bit. What was it about like the fantasy genre that maybe appealed to you so much, or do you not know?
I think it was just the fact that you can just use your imagination to be somewhere else, to just think of the possibilities of what that means. And fantasy always had this open door that allowed you to think of what if. And not to say that our world doesn't, because science has its own kind of what if,
Yeah.
but fantasy just did that in a more obvious way, especially for me as a kid.
Right. And so let me ask you then, so if you're kind of like in the background, you're reading all of this fantasy material, what are you doing? Like, what's like the foundation of what you do now for like for work or for life or whatever? Because every time I talk to someone that's doing RPG type stuff, RPGs are always something they love and they someday hope to make into their, career. But there's like something more practical maybe where they're sort of earning their living. What do
Yeah.
you do, if I might ask?
So by day, I work in HR.
Oh,
So that's
okay.
my day job. Yes.
All right. So actually, so as soon as you said that, I'm thinking this is a person that knows character creation, because like anyone that works in HR must be able to kind of look at different people and kind of like size them up and be able to tell like, well, that's a fighter, that's a wizard, that's a rogue, and that one's just not going to work out at this company in the party at all, really. So, okay, cool.
Yeah.
Is that something that you hope to eventually, because I just made an assumption, and that was that maybe you hope to make RPGs like a primary kind of form of career or whatever. Am I wrong in assuming that, or are they just more
Well,
something on the side?
yeah, I haven't really thought of RPG specifically as a career. It's just been a bit more broad as writing as a career. But I've also haven't set it as by X time or by some certain standard I need to be living off of writing. If anything, I like the you could say the comfort and freedom of having a day job brings, to be able to go back and write however I would like without the worry and the stresses that come from trying to make money off of something that you love.
Right. Yeah, which is to say, like you have some way to support yourself while you're struggling to sort of. Yeah, I definitely sort of know that idea. I think since I mentioned I'm a teacher, specifically I'm an English teacher, and I think the secret of all English teachers is that they really want to be like writers, or they want to be something like that, like on the side. That's what they do every night when they go
Yeah.
home, and then they
Yeah.
tear their hair out trying to finish that book while they, pay the bills with their teaching. Um,
Yeah, my
so that
grandfather was an English and math teacher, and he was just a poet most of the day.
Yeah, I can kind of see that. I think a lot of teachers sort of see themselves in that sort of a role. Well, can you tell me then, if this is sort of like something that right now is just, it's supplementary to like what you're doing here in your daily job and all of that. What sort of a role do role playing games play for you now, and what kind of prompted you, because you took it a little bit farther than most people, like, okay, I'm going to get together, it's Friday night, I'm going to go uh, eat some like chips and drink some soda and then play role-playing games. But you took it a step further by forming a community and then going online and starting to talk about it and have your voice heard. What prompted you to do that?
It's, I suppose, a bit of a funny story. But when I got into role play games, specifically to D&D, we had a group of some 10 or 12 people. We were all women, and we'd sometimes play, but we weren't always able to make it. We weren't all 12 playing together. No, it was more
I
like
know that would be
whoever
like
could kind of
nuts. I go crazy with
yeah,
six
no,
players.
it was whoever could kind of make it that time, and that's what got me into D&D. And I wanted more. I wanted more games that would run more frequently, and so I started looking around for any existing communities. I did find one, and seemed interesting. They talked about tabletop, and they said they're interested in fantasy, specifically tabletop role play games. And it was on this app that manages communities, and I signed up for it. And the sign up just asked, what games have you played, and all these things. It was a very fun form to fill out. I focused on video games and the like because I hadn't played much tabletop at the time. They responded back by saying that they're only interested in serious gamers. And that really seemed odd to me. And when I went and I took a look at the list of people that they have, I noticed that they were all men. And
Okay.
and so I started my own community of all women.
Yeah.
So it started out as sort of like
fight the power.
Community. Yeah.
Fight the power.
So I made my own community of all women, just out of kind of like, I don't need you. I'll have my own community.
Yeah.
It'll be cooler and better. We'll have homemade cookies.
I guess, actually, can I come into the women's community if there are cookies? That actually sounds a lot better than the men's role-playing community where we eat pretzels and drink beer, which then gives me indigestion. But at least cookies, I'd be happy with the indigestion.
Yeah. Then as the community grew and we had some 40 plus women, and I had, at the time I was running, I went a little bit too crazy, and I tried running 3 campaigns.
That is too crazy. In like
I scaled back.
But were you running like 3 per week, or did you kind of
space them out as 1 per week? But it still was a bit too much, and I wasn't able to give one its due or focus or any of the like. I pulled back, but then as the community grew, I started getting requests from men to join. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, okay, why not? And so the community became larger and not so focused. And what we have now is we do have, you could say, 2 parts. The part that's all women for those that still prefer to play only with women. And then another that is mixed that allows for that. And should anyone in the community want to have an all men's group, I'd also be happy to help have that facilitated with someone else. So it's just more of everyone's comfort level.
Why were you so interested though in, because this is something that I found in my past, but I want to know about other people in this respect. It sounds like you to a certain extent enjoy, I mean, the first time when you first formed the community, it was sort of out of necessity because you had been kind of maybe shunned in the other community. But it also sounds like, I have to admit, it sounds like you're enjoying running the community, and you're enjoying kind of facilitating, as you say, different sub-communities and then like mixing them together. Is this something that you just sort of enjoy, is building this sort of a network of people?
Definitely. It is something I've enjoyed, and a lot of it just comes from the reaction people get of, oh, I never knew that there were other people that played tabletop. It kind of sounds like this hobby everyone had hidden under a rock, and then realizing, oh, there's some 60 plus to 80 people playing it as well. That being said, I still wish I could do more for the community. There's a limit to how many things I could run myself.
Right.
But it is growing, and more people are helping.
Do you think has doing this kind of like opened you up to has this sort of changed the way that you live, maybe your everyday life in any sort of a way? Like, has role playing, building a community, thinking about and analyzing some of these games and all of that, has it changed? Has it had like an impact on what you do in your everyday, like say in HR, or maybe just when you talk to family members or friends, or think about things you're doing? Like, has that changed anything for you in any way?
It definitely has. I think the biggest one is I'm not the kind of person that does very well with surprise or with things that are unexpected. And I think with DMing or even playing, you kind of have to.
I was going to say, you may have picked the wrong hobby.
You have to accept the unexpected, and you have to roll with it and be flexible, and that's part of the fun. So it was hard at first, especially when I jumped into DMing without really playing. So I
Yeah.
didn't quite understand what things are supposed to be like, or rather what things could be like. And I learned with my thankfully patient players and
Always good to have.
yeah, and I think it's also carried over a bit to my personal life. Not going to say that I've become a completely flexible person,
I'm a better
but
person because of it.
yeah,
Yeah, I
definitely, it's really helped.
so I like the idea there that you mentioned a more flexible person. Like I think that's sort of it's actually an aspect of DMing that I had, or actually I consider myself a GM just because I play many different kinds of games. But I think it's an aspect of game mastering that I hadn't really considered that you bring up here is the idea to sort of make things up on the fly and or at least deal with them in a smooth way, or in a believable maybe way or a practical way. And I had actually never really considered that, but that's a really interesting observation, that you would kind of bring that up. So can I assume then, because one of the things I wanted to ask you is whether or not you consider yourself to be more of a player or more of a dungeon master? Is it safe to say that you consider yourself to be more of a DM, or are there aspects of both of those in you?
Uh, I think I consider myself to be more of a dungeon master just because I like telling stories. And
Yeah.
although you also do that as a player, definitely, the dungeon master has a bigger role in the world building and in just making this world feel alive and around you, and then just throwing all these challenges and different things that players can do. Um, I hadn't started really playing campaigns till after over a year of being a dungeon master, and it was a lot of fun playing as well. And I missed the sessions when it felt like week after week was uh, was a whole month. But
Right.
the fun that I get from the prep, even though there's also anxiety, which is part of
Yeah.
normal,
Yeah.
is
Well, that's
something
what
I
most
can't
of
see
us tell
myself with.
ourselves, right?
Yeah. So I can't see myself going for super long periods of time without being a dungeon master. I definitely need breaks, and sometimes I feel so unprepared for a session that I consider not having it. But in reality, is I can't go on for too long without being a dungeon master.
Yeah, and I think I kind of I think that just shows like a level of self-reflection maybe. And I think it's like I don't know about you, but it's sort of like something that I try to balance is what my eyes see and want to do versus what I can practically do because I'm only a human being that also has to work like a full-time job. So have you found that balance then to be about a game a week? Is that where you're at now? And so,
Yeah.
and you had mentioned that you just started in about a year ago. You had started actually working with a campaign. Does that mean that before then you had been running one shots or just kind of unrelated games, or had been games like broken down after two or three
Um,
sessions? Or
Not quite a year ago running a campaign, but we're like I spent a year DMing and then I was able to start playing.
okay,
Um,
okay,
yeah, yeah. As far as DMing, I picked up Lost Mines of Fandelver as the first game I DM'd, and then carried over, and now I'm running Storm King's Thunder. The balance I've found is post COVID,
right,
with
yeah,
COVID times,
yeah,
once a week. But before then, when there was a lot more going on,
hmm,
it was much less. It was once a month, sometimes twice a month if we could manage. Part of that was scheduling because
right,
as much as everyone wanted to play, there was quite a lot of real life responsibilities that
yeah,
pop up, and the group that I run is an all women's group, and each of us were at very different and interesting and fun life stages.
Sure.
With one of us about to be a mom, and then
Yeah.
and others working in creative careers that don't have as much flexibility as, like, say, a corporate kind of job.
Yeah.
And so there was this scheduling to work with. Upside of being cooped up at home is there's more time for TNT.
I was about to sort of ask about that. So it's interesting. I will say, the lockdown has been very good for my gaming. I'll freely admit that. Um, I ended up sort of meeting up with friends of mine that I had not played with since high school, and that means several decades I hadn't seen them. I have also kind of started a channel. I have been doing like online conventions, and I'm meeting people in Saudi Arabia who are playing games now. Like the lockdown has been great as far as exposing me to new people and new ways of looking at gaming, in that respect. Do you feel though that maybe the playing online doesn't give you the same feeling, or do you wrestle with the idea of playing online not being the same as like playing in person, or do you feel any kind of like a stress there or a friction or?
Well, I don't quite feel a stress or a fiction, because one thing that online play has done well is offer flexibility,
Mm-hmm.
where I don't think I'll even ever entirely let go of online play, even though my
Yeah.
players are all in the same area.
Mm-hmm.
But there is something that you can't replace with an in-person session, like
Yeah.
the chemistry, the
Yeah.
energy, and just the excitement, and the little things. And I had players that would come in cosplay of their characters, and that's
Yeah.
just the kind of thing you can no longer have with an online session.
Yes, you
Although
can. You can
we
have
have
people wearing costumes. What are you talking about?
we have worn costumes,
Right.
but it's just different when it's in person. You're
Yeah,
just
the
vibing off of
dynamic.
all these
Yeah.
things.
You're a little more
Yeah,
overwhelmed by that person in like their wizard's cap than you would be
yeah,
maybe online, like in person, right? So,
yeah.
um, at any rate, yes, I completely agree with that. I have to admit, though, I also think that I have learned, as someone that has been game mastering myself for many years, I feel like I'm trying to treat this as an opportunity to learn another aspect of games. So as a teacher, what I try to do is different students have different learning styles, right? So some students are kind of like they love to listen to a lecture. Other students like to see something visual. Other students need to get like a pen and paper and write things down. And what game mastering online has done for me is forced me to sort of look at a very particular set of entry points into accessing and engaging people. And in that respect, I don't want to do this forever, but in that respect, it's been a healthy kind of practice to work on those things, like balancing, like this, making this square box that I'm like sitting in somehow interesting. Even my hand gestures, like I don't gesture farther than a foot past my face anymore, even in real life, because I'm always thinking that I'm in a Zoom chat, and I'm always trying to frame myself properly. And so, like, it's given me so much to kind of think about. So in that, kind of like as a maybe a segue, then, is there a direction that you see yourself or the gaming kind of scene going in after kind of COVID passes us, and going into like the future in a way? Is there anything maybe from zooming RPGs that we might take with us, or is there something else that might sort of you'd like to see in the future for the gaming scene?
Well, I think in terms of So in terms of my community, there is a very strong preference to physical online play. It's a physical in-person play rather
Hmm.
than online. So I don't see playing on Zoom or other things really changing. And if anything, it's more of a crave to go back to exactly how it was, where we'd be able to meet up in a cafe or a meeting room that we could find and play and interact and talk. When it comes to my personal games, I think it does have uh, this added flexibility that we'll never let go of. Because even before, when people couldn't make it to a session, they'd come in online,
Hmm.
and so all we have now is kind of more tools because we were forced to use them,
Hmm.
even though they were always around.
Hmm.
Um, but from another perspective, and I think the one I find most important is it's as you've mentioned, it's made the world feel so much smaller because of this the lockdowns that happened. I was able to connect more with the Emirates community, more with the Bahrain community, and a lot more with the community in Jeddah and Riyadh, with the other cities in Saudi. And so that I don't think is going to go away whether or not we're able to play online again, because those are people we've met and connections we've made that are staying. So I see more of an exploration of the online to continue.
Yeah, I think in a way, and I obviously I can't, except for the students that I had from Saudi Arabia, and some of which obviously like after you graduate, you go on to become friends with them. Um, I what it sounds like you're saying, and it sounds really interesting here, is that those communities, that those little pockets, maybe throughout Saudi Arabia and of course the Gulf, are kind of connecting, and so in a way, it sounds like kind of like coming out on the other side of this. It's almost like a little bit of an awakening where, oh yeah, there are people out in Riyadh that also play D&D, or maybe they play Cipher System or some other game, and you'll be able to kind of connect with them, and maybe by doing so kind of build like an even bigger community that would probably ideally maybe spread it to people that didn't even know that games exist, or didn't know they could play them.
Definitely.
Yeah, I love that idea. So with to sort of get back to that idea of the community that you formed with what started out as it was a community for women. Um, you used the phrase in your description for the short online seminar that you did, the talk that you did, the phrase "fierce women," women that were in command. Can you tell me a little bit about maybe what that means to you, and or what it means in general, and maybe define that a little bit?
Mhm. I think for me, it means something a little bit simple, where it's a matter of despite any obstacles or any
Mm-hmm.
challenges, to just continue and do what you want to do and what you're trying to do. And I suppose that in itself is not really related to gender. But the reason why it is related to gender in that topic is just because it's very easy when there's more opposition to simply feel like, oh, it's just not meant to be, or if it'll happen, it would have been a little easier,
Mm-hmm.
or any of these things. So it's more of just to continue and just keep at it, really.
To sort of carry on, and persevere in the face of maybe odds that might be slightly stacked against you, or okay. And so what is it then, that prompted you to have this seminar, to do what you did? And for those of you that are watching at home and might not know about it, Safia ran a really great online seminar on women in gaming. And it was actually the way that I first sort of discovered who she was. I was just sort of looking around YouTube for different people to talk to, and things that topics that I thought were really interesting. And I just want to say this so everyone can kind of, well, I want to promote it because I think it's a really good thing. So I've been a teacher for about 20 years or so, and for me, I'm not going to say I'm really great at it, but I'm fairly comfortable talking in front of large groups of people unless it's on the internet where potentially anyone could do it, in which case I am a little bit nervous. But groups of like 20 or 30 people, maybe students, I feel very comfortable with. And over time, I've sort of developed a way of sort of approaching like a lesson and having a beginning, a middle, and an end, and many complex steps in between. The thing that made me stop and actually watch the seminar was the fact that it was very well run. It was very well done, and watching it, the questions were smart and engaging, and they didn't shy away from things that might be kind of painful or difficult to talk about. So I highly recommend. I've put links in the description below to a few of the things that Safia has done here on YouTube, and so I encourage you to go check them out. But I just digressed. I just. Oh.
No problem. Thank you for that, and I'm glad you enjoyed the talk that I did. So that talk came up from the convention that the Emirates community had, Gulf role playing, and they have been a huge support in wanting to have more women players, more women GMs, more both in their panels as well as having a panel for them. And they had asked me to come in and be the host for this panel, and invited the other women that were part of the talk, two of which I had known before, and one that I was happy to meet for that seminar as well. And so that's how it began, and it's been great to have that support of wanting more women representation from the communities across within the Middle East.
Yeah, I thought it was really great. And it's always very interesting for me, like as a teacher, I often I think one of the things that I enjoy about teaching is taking off like my teaching hat, and then I like to just sort of sit back and watch something else, because I'm always watching like for new information, new perspectives, new ways of looking at things. And when I watched that panel, I was like, oh, this is so new. And it's very refreshing sometimes to be able to do that and sit back and watch something that is well done and interesting, and it feels very, very relevant. And it also answers questions that I have, and answers questions that I didn't know that I really had. What was that like for you to just sort of, was that the first time you just jumped in and ran that, like something on YouTube?
Yeah. That's the first time I did anything on YouTube or a panel.
Right. Or a panel. And has anything to do with it at all. Yeah. Well, I think you did really, really well. So what has, if you don't mind me asking, can I ask what your specific experience maybe has been? And you've kind of touched upon it already. Like you tried to join that particular group and they said they were looking for serious players. What has your experience been with equal representation in maybe your own life or in the gaming community, whichever you feel most comfortable answering or talking about or want to talk about?
Yeah. So within the gaming community, this is kind of a worldwide thing. Anything related to gaming or nerd has been stereotypically seen as for men. And even though everything shows a counter to that, that's just been the notion that people see and understand, and some fight and contest as well anyway. So there's always that overlying idea, and that can present itself in different ways. I personally, either I haven't found it enough of a bother to me on my personal life to really focus on it. But then again, I haven't been exactly, I suppose I just don't let it bother me as much, and I just kind of continue on and do whatever I want. But in the few jobs I've had that have to do with writing video games, there has been more preference towards men in many ways. In fact, my first video game writing job, I had applied and submitted my application and everything. When they called me up, the man that spoke to me, his first tone was very surprised, but then continued politely. Later on, it turns out they hadn't realized I'm female. And when they called me, they assumed, like, they didn't really look at the name. So
Right.
they just called up the number as part of calling a lot of
Obviously, a
other
video game
applicants.
writer is going to be a guy.
Exactly.
Obviously.
So it was like immediate surprise and shock. And oh, okay. They glanced at the name, realized I'm
Right.
female. They were very polite, but it's just that there was that preconceived notion that, of course, I'd be male.
Right.
So to me, it's shown in these small ways rather than anything large that felt imposing.
Right. So but can I ask, did it have a happy ending and you got the job?
Yeah, I got the job. All went well. There were smaller struggles, but those are universal and probably in just about any career.
Yeah, yes, I would probably say that's a safe sort of assumption. I think it's a really interesting observation that you make. The fact that initially upon picking up the phone or talking to you, the person is surprised to find out that you're a woman. But then from there, maybe after a little bit of kind of like trying to get your footing back, the person actually continues and runs the interview and looks at your material and makes a judgment based on that. One thing that I think is interesting about that is the recovery aspects of that. Like the fact that, I see students every day in my classrooms who are surprised by a piece of information and then they become resistant to it because it knocks them off balance. But then there are other students that are surprised by a piece of information and they're like, they're a little off their footing for a moment, and then they readjust to this new piece of data, and then they sort of, continue. This wasn't really something I thought I was going to ask, but is there sort of a difference there in the attitudes of people perhaps that you've encountered, where there are some people that are like, oh, I'm a little surprised, okay, let's readjust, and then they do it, and then other people that are very resistant to it? And what would you say is maybe the difference between those types of people?
I don't think I've really run across many of them when it came to gaming. And I think part of that is because if they are very resistant to say, me leading a community or women playing or any of these things, or perhaps not even resistance, but it's just not their comfort level to be in groups that are mixed genders, then they simply wouldn't approach. So I think just by default of my community being led by me, there's like a filter that's already happening.
Right. Well, yeah, I see that because that was sort of related to something I was thinking about the group that you founded. So the idea is that, with the other group, maybe I assume there's a hierarchy of men that are running that group. And so it's kind of like men all the way down. But then in the group that you're running, because you're basically there at the top and you're the organizer of it, anyone entering the group itself is going to be filtered by the fact that, well, am I comfortable with, being in a group with other women? And if they are, then they continue and they just sort of say, okay, they do that thing where the footing is a little bit off for a minute and then they just say, oh, okay, well, no big deal. And then they start playing.
Yeah. So I haven't really faced anything like that. If anything, I've met quite a lot of very supportive, helpful people that I've learned a lot from, and people that have been excited for a community and would text me, okay, what can I do? How can I help? What do you need? And so really it's been a lot of overwhelming positivity, honestly.
I think that's great. I really do. Like, I think the idea of staying positive is super important. Is there anything you do to stay positive, or is it just something you kind of grew up being like, or have you been training for many years to be positive?
Oh no, I am a complete pessimist.
Okay, that's interesting. And yet you're positive. You're a positive pessimist?
Well, I'm positively pessimist,
Okay.
but so it's kind of a very, hang on, I hope this makes some sense, but I suppose by expecting the worst and raising and lowering my expectations, I end up being positive.
Right. I can see
But
it. I can understand.
but to be fair, I don't feel I've applied this when it came to tabletop gaming. It's just been this kind of exciting snowball where I don't really quite know what's going to happen next. So like when I first posted the first workshop of how to play D&D, I was like, hey, I'll get 5 people. That'll be cool. And I ended up with 25 and saying I can't take more.
That's really
So
great.
yeah, so it's just been a really nice constant surprise. And when I made the website, which was also fairly recent, within a week of making it, people signed up, and I if anything, I felt panicked of okay, people are going to sign up,
Wow.
but it's not like the community has weekly or even monthly events. We're still trying to catch our footing on having a proper scheduling. So it's like they're going to join, and there's not so much happening. I have to
Right.
make things happen. So if anything, it's been such a fantastic experience that I just feel like I want to do more.
What was your first workshop like? So like you advertise that you're doing a workshop. You're like, okay, let's do a workshop. I'm gonna run it. I assume you run it. And now it's 5 minutes before the workshop. What is Safia doing for the workshop? What did you do?
So the first workshop, because I didn't expect a lot of people to show up, I had just talked to a local cafe that is relatively busy, but I just really thought it would just be one small table, and it's having a casual conversation of what Dungeons and Dragons is. But a lot more people signed up, and in my head, I'm thinking, yeah, okay, 10 signed up, but are they really going to show up?
Right.
You know? And then in the end, it was more than 10 because people were like, hey, is it okay? I got my friend. And this cafe, who was very supportive of us, we had the largest table that they had. And it was me standing, trying my best to project my
Yeah.
voice. And it doesn't project that far in a crowded cafe. And even a few people were passing by and would just see that I have the Dungeon Master set up and the books. And be like, oh, is this D&D? Can I join?
Oh,
They weren't
really?
even part of that workshop.
People just
Yes.
seeing you there and they're like, "Oh, I'll do that." Yeah. I
Yeah. So it was unexpected. And I ended up with people that a lot of them knew how to play. So
but
they
they
didn't come here to learn. They came here because they wanted to meet people. There were some that hadn't played ever or had only heard of the game from Stranger Things and came. Um, but yeah, I ended up having people that also knew how to play, and they'd chip in and give their examples, and some of them were even game designers. So it was like a broad spectrum of experience that I didn't know we had, which is amazing.
That's cool. That's really great. And so there you are. I kind of know what you mean as a teacher. No matter what happens in front of the class, like I'm always kind of faking it till I make it. And it gets easier with like 4th and 5th graders because then you're like, well, the sky is blue because of this reason, and they're like, yeah, okay, that's cool. But then when when you start teaching 12th graders and college kids, they're a little bit more skeptical about that sort of a thing. But I totally identify with that kind of idea. From that standpoint, then, the idea of going into a community and sort of taking on a leadership role. I wanted to talk about something that was super interesting to me, and that I think is really worthwhile discussing, and that is your breakdown of the Alcadem setting, which I haven't watched all the episodes. I watched like a couple or three of them, which I thought was really, really fascinating. So I want to give proper credit here because or maybe you could, why don't you tell us whose idea was that? And can you tell us a little bit about what it is and what you're doing with that?
Yeah. So when it comes to reading through the Al-Qadim setting, uh, there's actually the podcast run by Asians Represents, where they critically read through all of the material with a cast of different people, all from Asian backgrounds. And then there's the Zakhara Re-Told, which is by Arabia 20,
Okay.
and my good friend Ahmed, who also started his community uh, based in Jeddah, and then it grew and spiraled and covered quite a bit of MENA, and Crossroads is also a kind of a sister community with them too.
Mm-hmm.
So in the stream with Ahmed, what we do is we look at the Zakhara world in a critique of uh, as a DM, what am I going to take now? Because this was written for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. It's no longer the same game. It's gone quite a long time, and it was written back quite a while from now. So naturally, the material doesn't all carry over. Some of it would change. So our read through is saying what we would use, how we would change things, and what we think is great as is. So that's the two differences between them. While one is more of a critical read through of everything as far as representation goes with Asian Represents, and then the Arabia 20 is a more personalized touch of what would I do if I were running this game. And
So then,
Ahmed actually is running Zakhara. I will be running, well, I'll be writing my own Arabic setting campaign and then
oh,
running that eventually.
wait, and those are separate.
Yeah.
Okay, okay, got it. So then, what have you found from going through? What have you personally found and maybe been sort of surprised by or interested in or found to be like true or um, what kind of piques your interest as you're going through and looking at it from that perspective?
So I think to me the biggest thing that surprised me is the way Al-Qadim was approached. And Al-Qadim is not approached um, as a historical accurate setting that's meant to represent a culture or community. If anything, from the get-go on the introduction, they're saying that this is based on an Araby, which is a romanticization of the Arabic culture. And they even cite that movies, and they specifically mean Western movies, are part of their source of material, and they really cite 1001 Nights, which is not really a historic account. It's a romanticization. So it's a very different way of looking at it, and it's but it is creating a setting of intrigue based on Arabic culture. So from the get-go, that's a very different approach than I would take writing an
Mm-hmm.
Arabic setting, because I would want one that is uh, more steeped in culture and history, uh, not necessarily to be historically accurate, but enough that if you're playing it, you end up learning a couple of things here or there about history in the Arabic region. So those are two different approaches. But what I was pleasantly surprised to see with Al Qadim is um, they did focus a lot more on Arabic language in terms of trying to use it in the names that they used, in the different subclasses that they've added, or kits actually, since that's what they were called in AD&D, not subclasses. So that kind of uh, I found that interesting. The other thing is with Al Qadim, it might be because it's an older campaign setting with AD&D, but they they did have it organized in a way of all these options all over the world, and then you mix and match and figure out how to run
Mm-hmm.
something with it. Where I suppose I'm used to something that could be a bit more streamlined and hand holding. So that's just a very different approach for me to take and look into. I felt confused approaching the material. But I realize, there's a whole gap of time that the content creators used and improved. So I'm looking at now comparing it to back then, which is very unfair. Um, uh, but overall, I think Al-Qadim takes a mix and mash of romanticization and then some real actual ideas from religion, and that's the part where I would probably shy away from instead.
And so with that idea then, what is it that you're, I mean, maybe you don't want to reveal it because you don't want to spoil it for your players who may be listening and watching now, because you're actually getting some comments about can't wait for that, looking forward to that. But if you want to vaguely share something about like what you are creating and what your approach kind of to that is, maybe what are you doing for your own creation then?
Well, so my Arabic campaign setting is still being written, so I won't run it for at least another year or more.
Mm-hmm.
So by the time that happens, it's fine and I can talk about it here.
Yeah, they will have forgotten by then.
Yes. Yeah. So
no, I see a pair of eyeballs that are like, no, they're listening. Sorry.
It's fine. So the approach that I'm taking really is I want to take Arabic culture and history, mainly pre-Islamic, but kind of take an aggressive jump into throwing so much magic in there that it becomes its own, where it doesn't really serve to represent a single culture or nation, but it just shows this amalgamation of different Arabic traditions and cultures that as an Arab who could play it would be like, I see where that's from, and kind of enjoy these bits and pieces, or kind of pick up and for the few history nerds that might play it would be like, oh, this is inspired by that. So it's that kind of general approach that I'm taking, and then just cover it in so much magic and have of its own that it becomes its own thing. It's not a single country. It's not the Middle East. It's not North Africa. It's just a lot of everything.
Yeah, it's a world that you have created, inspired by certain aspects here, there, and in other ways. Yeah, and I'm so sorry to tell you this. There's a lot of people saying we are listening. There are ears that are coming up. So I think you may have a lot of rewrites to do in the next year before people play your game, because otherwise I've just spoiled it by asking you those questions.
No problem.
So with that in mind then, what is this your big project? I was going to kind of ask you, well, you know what, let's rewind a little bit before I get into that. Is there a project from your past or something you're doing now that you're really proud of, or you feel like, wow, I'm so glad I did this, or was particularly good for you, like in a personal way or a professional way?
Well, so two things. One is the community that I feel I'm, even though I do feel I don't do enough, it's still something I'm happy to have done. And then the second thing, it's different and more personal. It's trying to write my book and get it published, which did involve going and pitching to agents and all these things and getting rejections, which has been character building.
Yeah, you just put them up on the wall and you frame them, and then you look back on them after you're published, and you're like, and then you keep track of each one, and you write people back, and you just go, look at that sucker, you could have chosen my book, but you didn't.
One day.
Yeah, and that's that positive kind of outlook. Is just you're just gonna continue. Can I ask in a few sentences then, what's your story about? Unless you want to tell us more, but what is the book that you're writing about?
So the book I'm writing is about this young girl that suddenly develops magic unbeknownst to her in a world where magic isn't the norm. And through an inability to control it and being put in a tough situation, finds herself that she's now a murderer and is on the run. And she's 11, along with her other friends that are incriminated along with her. And this puts someone rather innocent in a moral dilemma, forced to explore a world beyond their scope of understanding, dealing with things that they can't deal with. And I think that is something people can relate to in all ages, even though the target is middle grade.
Was there a particular reason you chose? And I'm asking now as a teacher, because it's like I won't ever say what my favorite grades are to teach because I don't want to offend any of those those kids that are not that grade. Why did you choose middle grade for your target audience?
So at first, the idea was, okay, let me try young adult. But the more I tried to write in young adult, the more I realized it's focused on a lot of topics, and the genre itself had expectations, and what works in the genre so much isn't something I really cared for. And that includes things like having a romance trope and having a triangle and all these things. It just made me realize, no, I don't think I'm writing an adult book.
Yeah.
So then it was by the help of an editor I met at a literature festival, who kind of asked the obvious question of, why not go middle grade?
Right.
And it was like just explosions of,
Yeah.
that makes sense. I could just go middle grade. Why not? And I didn't need to change so much in the writing. The edits were more of changing a bit of the perspective, maybe making some of the descriptions a little bit more whimsical, even though I'm talking about a hard topic. But that was it.
I think that's like that's like an important thing, is finding like that sweet spot of where you're writing toward. And when you do that, it can really unlock a lot, not just for the story, but for the writer themselves, right? Like I would imagine that suddenly when this kind of light bulb went off, I'm guessing it's not easy, but it became relatively easier, and you knew what sort of an angle to approach.
Yeah,
that
did. And it did put in perspective some questions I'd get from writing workshops of why are you writing, or who are you writing for? And I realized that the audience I really cared for is the little reader that wants to see themselves in something. And I am writing a fantasy book that is about an Arab little girl, even though it's set in a world that is not our own. And so that does kind of have that representation of, why not? Fantasy can be just about anyone, anything, any color.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think what's interesting about fantasy to me is I feel like it crosses cultures. You know, if you go back and you look at, you know, legends or mythology and things like that, in almost any culture, you're going to find people with abilities, monsters with, like, you know, powers, and stories about, you know, all kinds of things that are rooted in the fantasy, what we would call a fantasy genre. And so in that respect, it's almost like this kind of like Rosetta Stone. Like you can kind of look at each aspect of fantasy in a way as a reflection of the things going on in a culture, like as it's developing, or even today. I mean, I'm sure, you know, if you look at fantasy that's popular in the world, or in the United States, or in Saudi Arabia, or whatever, given 50 years or 100 years into the future, we could probably say, oh, well, I see why, you know, Lord of the Rings was so popular at that time, or Star Wars, or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, I mean, storytelling is something that is present in all cultures, and because of that, we all have our lore and our monsters and things like that have come up from these storytellings, whether it's just to scare children or just to wonder what that weird noise was. So that's fantasy, and then that turns into the more fantastical creatures that are also beautiful and all these things. So that is present everywhere, and it's something fun to be able to see more of, to see more of what makes up the fantasy landscape of every different culture.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, Safia, thank you very much. We're about out of time. You've been very generous. You've given us an hour, and with that hour is about up. Thank you so much for coming on the program. I also want to thank all of the viewers. You brought with you a tidal wave of viewers. I'm like looking at the chat right now, and I wanted to apologize to them. I'm still kind of getting my YouTube streaming feet here, and I'm not always able to, like, I do see the comments, and I'm pretty sure Safia saw them as well. Not always able to juggle like comments, broadcasting, watching the Zoom stream, getting my questions right, and all of that in a way that's super smooth. But I do appreciate the audience tonight, and most of all, though, Safia, I appreciate you for coming on and introducing me and potentially a lot of other people to what's going on in Saudi Arabia with the gaming scene, and just to yourself. So thank you so much for coming on tonight.
Thank you for having me.
All right, we will see you all maybe in a few weeks for the next episode of Role Player with 1,000 Faces. To all of you out there, good night.